Hi, I'm Jeana Roth, and welcome to the third breakout session. This is the trauma track, and we are now untangling. The title of my presentation today Is the Church Even Safe? If you're here, I'm hoping it's because you have been tracking with all of our discussion this weekend, and you're trying to figure out how to maybe engage in a church or religious institution. This one will be a little bit more focused on the Christian church. So if you are interested in any other adaptations or other spirituality, maybe you can hit me up in the comments and the Q&A after this session. But the short answer to is the church even safe is no, not always. Just like any other group, churches can be unsafe as well. In the previous session, we looked at attachment as a way of understanding trust building within the self. As we look toward the church, we might be tempted to think that the church has it figured out or that it won't hurt us. This is unfortunately not always the case. How do we evaluate safety and understand our own responses to trauma triggers? So safety is important because it's the state where our brain is most rested and ready for action. We can learn to tune in with ourselves to understand when we do not feel safe by identifying trauma responses. It's also helpful to identify the trauma triggers themselves. So those trauma triggers are people, places, things, thoughts, smells, memories. Really, it can be anything, something that reminds us of past trauma. Often that has a sensory input quality to it, whether that's a smell, a sight, or a sound, something like that. Have you considered your experience in Christian Science as a traumatic experience? Is there a sense of interpersonal trauma as you consider how those who were meant to care for you brought you into a cult experience that shaped your life? If this is the first time you've considered Christian Science as traumatic, this may take some time, so just be patient with yourself and with me. It's somewhat beyond the scope of this particular session. However, I do want to acknowledge that what you're experiencing is real and important. And I don't want to name your experience for you as trauma. However, this is kind of the general consensus from the people that I've worked with. We will do so and use this as the premise for this particular presentation, that Christian Science is a trauma, and as such we can respond to it as a trauma. All right, so what is trauma? If this word is not familiar to you, I just want to give you a little bit of background on trauma. So trauma or traumatic stress occurs when stress becomes too overwhelming for the brain to process. So you can see here that stress has two sides of it, trauma and resilience. So if that stress is predictable or sporadic, it's moderate, or the just right challenge, something that's just beyond your reach that you can still attain, then it's more likely to develop into resilience, right? So if you're training as a runner, you don't start with a marathon, right? You build little by little, and that builds that resilience, that builds that ability for your body to adapt to the exercise and to move forward. Conversely, trauma is when the stress is unpredictable or continuous or overwhelming in some way. And what happens is that your body sends you into fight or flight. You may have heard some of those terms, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more in depth. Okay, so trauma in the brain. I often find that for people who are coming out of a Christian Science background, that the brain anatomy is not a given. So let's take some time to think through parts of the brain. A couple different parts I'm going to highlight. I'm not going to go through everything. I don't think that that's really necessary. But when we talk about trauma, there are a few key components at play. That's the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Okay, so when functioning integratively, the prefrontal cortex, or PFC, and the amygdala are touching, allowing us to rationally talk about our fear responses. Okay, I want you to go like this. I want you to put your thumb inside your hand and then close your fingers over it. This is a portable hand model of the brain. So you always have this with you. And what I want you to notice is this little spot where your thumb is touching your palm is right in your brain where the amygdala would be located, okay? And then this part is the cortex. It's the outer part covering the brain. This is where your higher thinking, the thinking that you think you're doing takes place. But the truth is there's actually different layers to our brain, and that amygdala is part of that primal reptilian piece of your brain that's automatic. Right? The fear responses are automatic, and they trigger body responses that are also automatic. Ideally, with this hand model, we want those pieces to be touching, because then our higher level thinking is in connection with our fear response. So if something scary comes in place, we can check the facts, find out if we're actually in danger, and then we can assess. We can either run away or we can fight off the threat. If we come across a snake, I need to know, okay, it's a snake, it's dangerous, or it could be dangerous. Do I know anything about this particular snake, right? All of that stuff is happening up here in the cortex. And ideally what we want is for those things to be communicating. What happens when a trauma memory is too stressful is that literally you flip your lid, right? So this cortex and this amygdala part become disintegrated and are no longer touching. Right? So it sends the chemicals in a different route in your brain. So your brain obviously doesn't literally flip up or move, but those chemicals are no longer connecting those parts. And so it might as well be flipped fully and physically. Practically speaking, your brain can come back online via mindfulness practice and calming the body. So we would call that a bottom-up approach. So we can think of that as the bottom parts of the brain. So starting with the amygdala and moving towards that prefrontal cortex. And we can also think about it as the bottom as in our body. So if I slow my breath, I'm using my body to help calm my brain. Okay, so that's that bottom-up approach. I guess just in contrast, let me let you know what a top-down approach might look like. It might look like, stop feeling that way. You're fine. Everything's okay. Don't worry about it, right? You're trying to logically convince yourself, or maybe your child, if that's something you've noticed with your child. You're trying to logically convince someone of something that doesn't seem to connect with what they're experiencing in their body. It's not as effective with trauma, and typically it's something that we would not recommend in a trauma-informed approach. Okay, trauma in the brain. PTSD is when there is a prolonged pattern of that disintegration in the brain due to traumatic stress. PTSD can be acute, chronic, or complex, and should be diagnosed by a mental health professional. Complex PTSD points to the developmental nature of trauma at an early age, where it's formative. Trauma can impact all aspects of a person's life, including mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. Research suggests that prolonged trauma may disrupt and alter brain chemistry. Okay? So your brain becomes used to the way it's responding. If you always see a snake and get scared, the next time you see a snake, you're more likely to get scared. That's how your brain chemistry can get altered in a long-term situation, in an ongoing or more profound way. In contrast, maybe there's a person who really likes snakes, right? Their brain chemistry is not sending a trauma response in response to a snake. A lot of that is conditioning in our environment and how we handle that trauma, whether that trauma becomes resolved or and integrated into our experience, or whether that becomes an ongoing, continual thing. A good example of trauma in the brain is the idea of a thorn. If you think of a thorn as some sharp object poking into your skin, that object is there. And as long as you don't move it, as long as you don't move your finger, maybe I've got it in this finger, as long as I don't move my finger, I'm going to be fine. Right? It doesn't hurt. I don't notice it. But as soon as I knock my finger or try to bend my finger, it's irritating the skin around it. And your body is actually always trying to push out a thorn. Our brains are the same way. They are healing. They want to heal themselves. They want to push that out. What that might look like is more pain in the meantime, but the ultimate goal is to get that thorn out. The ultimate goal in the brain is to get that traumatic experience out. Okay, so your brain's kind of working on this, but then it feels bad, and so oftentimes we hold still, like, oh, nope, I don't want that thorn out. Okay, so we want to kind of understand what's happening so that we can be part of that process of healing and actually start to work on some of those trauma experiences in the brain. I want to go through just a few of those complex PTSD symptoms. I think that might be helpful in terms of processing what that could look like in real life. So this table is one taken from an article at psychiatrictimes.com. You're welcome to look that up and see the table. I think there's a clearer version. I couldn't get that version for this presentation, but did want to give you the link in case you wanted to go look at it yourself. Typically with complex trauma, we see deficits in several different areas. So problems with affect regulation, whether that's anger, fear, shame, sadness or depression, disgust and revulsion. So the way that you're able to regulate those things is not always consistent or congruent is what we might call that. Problems with safety and impulse control. Okay, maybe because you're not used to really protecting and doing things that are good for your body, you might actually be more prone to suicidality or self-injurious behavior or danger to others, alcohol, substance abuse, eating disorders, high-risk behaviors, criminal behavior. Okay. Other problems with attention and state stability and dissociation, you might depersonalize or de-rationalize. I think it says derealization, dissociative amnesia, spontaneous trance. Okay, so you might notice yourself glazing over in a way that's not helpful, right? You might dissociate on the spot. It might become too much and your brain just checks out. Those might be symptoms you might experience. Problems with identity and self-perception. So identity confusion, who am I? Right? Who am I apart from Christian Science? Who am I inside Christian Science, right? There's not necessarily this development of the ego or identity that we would hope to see at some point at adolescence that would start to develop. It also might lead to unstable self-image or sense of self, body image problems, dissociative identity disorder, okay, like having to tune out and almost creating dissociative identity disorder was previously called multiple personality disorder. So those personas or other personalities would develop in order to protect the core. Problems with body image or somatization, eating disorders, somatic symptom disorders, non-epileptic seizures, other conversion disorder symptoms, somatic symptoms, all of that, medical neglect, okay? You might be prone to medically neglecting yourself because that's what you were taught, right? And that's also a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder, complex PTSD. The next category is problems with systems of meaning. The self is seen as irreparably damaged, bad, shameful, blameworthy, pervasive mistrust of others, belief in responsibility for events one cannot control, intense focus on control, the world is seen as completely dangerous and untrustworthy, taking perspective of the abuser or rationalization of perpetrator behavior. Gosh, those are hard. Those systems of meaning get distorted because you've been gaslit on a major scale for a long period of time. That's a complex trauma. Problems with relationships and attachments. If you've listened to any of my other sessions, you know I love talking about attachment, but that insecure, disorganized attachment, pervasive mistrust of others, problems with stable attachments, problems with intimacy, attachment to or enmeshment with perpetrators. That's a big one. That's important. Repeated unsafe or violent relationships. Again, you're not sure what safety is. So it's easy to come out of that and say, okay, I'm just going to repeat these things because that's all I know. Right? And so ideally we'd want to see those move into the direction of safety, right? Creating safe attachments within yourself, with other people, and ultimately with a higher power, with God, or within spirituality. The other idea that's helpful when we think about triggers is this idea of the window of tolerance. We all have a window of tolerance. There's a space where we feel comfortable, right? Maybe that's a square, maybe that's a rectangle, maybe that's like a huge box. Whatever the size and shape of your window of tolerance, it's important to know what happens if you go below it and what happens if you go above it. So this is based, this particular diagram comes from the book The Betrayal Bond by Patrick Carnes, and he talks about the interpersonal trauma when there has been toxic relationships and trauma long term. So if you look there in that middle, that green section is the optimal state. So feeling calm and in control. This is your comfort zone, the ability to regulate emotions. Triggers such as fear or threat cause survivors to leave this balanced mental state. Over time, they do find it to be more difficult to regulate emotions and may overshoot repeatedly when trying to do so. Okay, but this is that middle. This is the sweet spot. This is when we can grow and learn and change and start to untangle. We can start to assess safety. All of those things are kind of within that optimal state. What happens when we go up? So in that hyperarousal state, this is the fight or flight response. Survivors experience extreme awareness or vigilance against perceived threat or fear. Overwhelming feelings, high levels of anxiety, and emotional outbursts of anger and rage. Rush of adrenaline is exhausting, addictive, and unsustainable long term. Okay, so this is fight or flight. Again, if we go back to the hand model, this is when we flipped our lid and the amygdala is running the show. And that fear response that we find in the amygdala, and that is secreted through adrenaline and then through cortisol, which are our two stress hormones, those things are firing without your permission, right? Without the permission of the cortex, without the permission of the thinking that we think we're thinking, right? That outer layer of our brain. The ideal is not to live in hyperarousal, but to live in that comfort zone. Okay, now let's go below. What happens if we're hypoaroused? So this is the freeze response. Survivors shut down against perceived fear or threat. They feel disconnected, unaware, and numb. Long term, they may lose the ability to feel or lose touch with reality. Okay. This one's a bit tricky just because of some of the pitfalls within Christian Science in general, but I just want you to focus in on the fact that it's that kind of dissociation, right? You have to escape somehow. It's still a coping mechanism, just like the triggered response, the fight or flight state is, but it's slightly different. It's more like detached, right? So instead of like racing around trying to figure out what to do, it's sort of like a withdrawal within the self. Okay? All right, so that's the window of tolerance. One of the other things that's important about the window of tolerance is that we can expand it. So if we practice mindfulness, we might go from something like this up to this, okay? So the idea is that we want that window of tolerance to be as big as possible because that's the optimal state. That's where we're going to experience the most safety and the most in tuneness with ourselves, integration, all of that. That's the comfort zone. That's where we want to try to be if we can. All right. I want to repeat this because I want this to be clear. The trauma of Christian Science is not your fault. You did not choose this. This happened to you, and this is not your fault. We still have to do something about it, and that is really, it's just a not happy situation, right? Because you have the long-term impacts of Christian Science in you, and yet you didn't choose it, right? It's not your fault. Even if you did choose, even if you were a first-generation Christian Science member, it's still the grooming and the cult itself that are responsible for the trauma. Just want you to remember that. Let's talk specifically about Christian Science and trauma. So this session is based on the premise that Christian Science and other spiritually abusive teachings are processed as trauma in your brain. You may feel a flashback when the setting feels familiar to Christian Science. So let's say maybe you feel the format of a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night testimony service, or particular phrases that might be used in those contexts. Different songs, right? Different hymns. I've heard several times there are hymns that are, the words are one thing within Christian Science, and then another set of words within Christian churches, right? And that could be really triggering, even just hearing those melodies over and over again. So those flashbacks and triggers can be obvious like that, or they can be more subtle. They might connect to an image, a scent, a tone of voice, or other sensory input. So my encouragement to you is just to slow down and tune in with these triggers as much as possible. The more we're able to name when I hear that music, or when I think about getting ready for a Wednesday night service and I, wear a certain color of skirt, like that's the color of skirt I always wore to a Wednesday night testimony service, or whatever it might be, just tune in with those and take an inventory. I think that's the best thing you can do with that. Also, learning to trust others after your entire attachment framework has been distorted does take time. So please, 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 please be patient with yourself. Give yourself lots of grace in this process, and just take your time, right? So let's talk specifically and maybe more practically about how does this impact me in a new church or religious setting. Let's say you have left Christian Science years ago and you want to be getting into a new church, and now that COVID has passed and you are venturing out into the big wide world, you have decided that you want to start attending a church. How do you know if it's safe? How do you assess that in the moment? And I want to focus on a couple things. I've got some tips, but this material actually comes from a book called Toxic Faith: Experiencing Healing from Painful Spiritual Abuse. And in chapter 10, Arterburn and Felton talk about 17 characteristics of healthy faith. So I'm just going to list them out here for you, but I'd really encourage you to pick up this resource if you're interested in this. They go into much better detail, and they also talk about systems as a whole, and it would be a great book to read just in preparation for rejoining a faith community, and trying to steer away from faith communities that might be more toxic, especially if that's not familiar to you, or you don't know what that looks like within a Christian or mainstream Christian context. Okay, so remember that non-Christian Science churches can also be spiritually abusive. While the intent is for church to be a safe haven and a hospital for those who are hurting, this is not always the case. Be wise as you settle into a new community and assess your safety often. Okay, look for these things in a safe church community. These are good things, okay? This list is good. So often we focus on the bad, and that plays an important part, but these are the things we want to be seeking out. Keep this list on you. Look for these things in your new church, or in the church that you're at, or a faith community that you're at the moment. Okay, let me just read through these. Focused on God, respectful, self-worthy or feeling value, trusting, relationship-oriented, balanced, non-judgmental, able to embrace our emotions, loving, growing, free to serve, vulnerable, individualized, personal, non-defensive, reality-based, and able to embrace our humanity. So notice the contrasts there, able to embrace our emotions and able to embrace our humanity, right? Trusting and building relationships, but also individualized, right? We've got a lot of balance there. It's never going to be either or. It's the combination and the balance between those things. Again, I'd really encourage you to seek out that resource if at all you're interested in ways to move towards health, whether that's within yourself and within your own church community. That's a resource you can take to your own church, or within yourself, or within the community itself. All right, let's talk through just a few more tips for assessing that safety in church. Let's think about finding a church that doesn't have those obvious triggers, whether within the facilities or the main staff. Let's say you went to a Christian Science church that was an all brick building and had a certain shape of door. Okay? If every time you walk through the door of a new church and it's brick and that door is the same shape, you might find that that's not going to be the right fit for you. It doesn't matter how great it is, it's not going to be the right fit. You may in time decide that you want to try back there and see if that trigger has been desensitized. But it might not be the best fit for you, and just feel free to let that go. Part of what's frustrating about triggers is they're not always predictable. In fact, they're not usually predictable. They kind of pop up here and there. So assessing safety and maybe avoiding the ones that have obvious triggers. Let's say maybe the main staff, maybe the main pastor's name is George or Mark or whatever. Maybe that was a name that you no longer like because that was the name of one of your previous abusers. That would be something where you might avoid a church where the main person's name is Mark, or talk to this person and tell that person that that's a trigger for you, and maybe they'll give you a different name to maybe you can develop a nickname or something else. Be creative, but also know that it's okay to take some time and space. The second one is check in with your gut to see where you are in that window of tolerance. Okay, so keep that in mind, right? Where am I in the window of tolerance? Am I hyper aroused, or am I hypo aroused, or am I in that optimal state? Do I feel at rest and ready to respond? Ask questions about your freedom. Ask yourself questions about your freedom. Am I allowed to disagree? Am I encouraged to move at my own pace or as I am comfortable? Like, is there pressure? Do I feel like I have to conform to something outside of myself? Next, ask yourself questions about the relationships. Do I feel known and understood? Do I feel forced to depth that I don't feel comfortable with? Is there balance between the individual and the community? We don't want total dependence on a community, but we also don't want total individuation, right? We want that balance between the two, and hopefully that synergy between them that complements each other. We want you to I want to encourage you to trust your own gut in when and how you feel safe. Maybe attending a church online is actually a good thing, because then you can turn off your screen or you can mute it. You have more ways to respond when you don't feel safe. Also, just take it slow and evaluate often. Again, that mindfulness is so important. Be careful not to impose an artificial timeline on yourself. Remember that God knows what you've been through with Christian Science, and believe that He wants good, healing things for you. He is building His people into a community that is His bride, which often, but not always, coincides with the physical church. I like this verse from 1 Peter 2:5. So often we can think about church only as a building or as a specific local group. But remember that you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. So just remember that you are one of those stones. You're living stones, and the work God is doing in you is at His pace, right? And He invites you into that work too. So the more you're able to, again, tune into yourself and understand what God is doing and how He is moving in and through you, I think the more you'll feel that connectedness that you're longing for within church. And finally, I just wanted to list out a few other related resources. Here in just a second, we're going to end with another mindfulness exercise. But let's talk about these real quick. Toxic Faith was the book I mentioned by Stephen Arterburn and Jack Felton. This book helps to identify toxic systems and patterns that can be present in any religious system. There are chapters on roles in toxic faith systems and on characteristics of healthy church systems. The other book is Betrayal Bond, 2019, by Patrick Carnes. So 2019 is the most current version. This book may be helpful if you're working through interpersonal trauma. It also contains an assessment for which of the 8 trauma responses, or which combination of those trauma responses you might naturally go towards. This book also discusses the window of tolerance as a way of optimizing trauma processing. This book in particular is not written from a Christian perspective, but I do find a lot of truth in this work, and having gone through that with other people who've gone through spiritual abuse, sometimes it's actually really nice to not have Christian language or spiritual language when you're looking at trauma from that on that plane, on that level. But I would encourage you, if you are going to go through betrayal bond, to find someone that you can meet with and talk through it, whether that's a professional or a friend, just to be able to process through some of that stuff, because it does bring up a lot, and it is a pretty intense book. All right, and like I said, I just want to finish with a mindfulness exercise. We talked about that window of tolerance and different ways to expand that window of tolerance. One of the best ways that we can expand that window of tolerance is through breathing. Just a little bit behind the body chemistry of it is that you're at the bottom of your lungs it's almost like a balloon. It's called your diaphragm, and it fills up with air when you take deep belly breaths. So if you imagine just putting your hands on your stomach and then breathing in, and as you breathe in, pushing your stomach out. If you notice, my shoulders don't really go up. When I breathe from my lungs, but when I breathe from my belly, as a trained musician, this might be something you're already familiar with if you have a background in music. But I just want to encourage you, because what's happening when you do belly breathing is that diaphragm is actually situated so that it pushes against your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are two small little glands that are located on top of each kidney in your back. So kind of in the middle of your back, right next to the spine, there's your kidneys, and then the adrenal gland sits on top. And that diaphragm expands against the adrenal glands. And as it does that, what it does is it sends a message to those adrenal glands that you're safe, right? It's one of those bottom-up ways to create safety, to create to help your body tune in with the fact that you are safe. So I just want to, as we breathe, just notice that your body is doing that. That God made your body so that it would respond to these healing measures in ways that literally change the chemistry in your body, right? They reduce the cortisol and the stress hormones in your body, and they bring you to that place of rest and recovery. So I'm just going to lead us through a short breathing exercise. And just what I want you to do is just go ahead and close your eyes, turn off your camera if you'd like. I'm just going to go ahead and close my eyes, and what I want you to do is just to start to take breaths. Notice trying to take breaths from your belly. It's okay if that's new to you and that doesn't come easily. Just try. If it helps either now or at a time in the future, go ahead and lay on your back on the floor. You can lay on your back on the floor and actually try to push your stomach up into the air. Just a simple rhythm of in and out. And in and out. The more stress you feel, the more important it is to breathe out longer than you breathe in. So if you wanted to kind of count along with me, I'm going to breathe in for 4 and then out for 6. So in, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, in, out. In, out. One more time, in, out. That's really it. So by utilizing this tool regularly, you can again create more space in that window of tolerance. Continue to use that skill regularly, and you're going to, like a muscle, develop that resilience and that space that we need in order to reset our body after we've had a trauma trigger. Or maybe you are trying to just get out of that trauma space for the first time. Maybe you've noticed you sit in that trauma space a lot. So anytime you can give your brain that space and that break from being in the trauma, with the trauma hormones and trauma emotions and trauma chemistry within your body, the better. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for being here today. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.